Welcome, everyone. My name is Helena
You're live.
Kanika, and I'm your moderator for this session, which is called 2 Million Reasons to Commit a Murder. The session is number 2 in stream 2. So if you're looking for a different session, you'll be able to find all of them in the menu on the left. Just click on the session tab and click on the one that you're interested in attending. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this session, Tam Bui. Tam is a retired detective staff sergeant. He spent almost a decade working in the homicide squad for one of North America's largest police services. Due to the graphic and sensitive nature of Tam's presentation, it's not suitable for all viewers. Some people may be triggered by the content, and we ask that you view at your own discretion. There is a support person available to connect with should you, after attending this session, feel you need to process. You'll find their booth in the exhibit hall, or just simply inquire at the Abuse Hurts booth to be directed to. That being said, Tam's session is incredibly informative and insightful. So welcome, Tam. We're so looking forward to your talk today.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. It's been a long and very interesting day. I'm here in Newmarket, Ontario at the Abuse Hurts headquarters with Ellen and her team. I'd like to thank her very much for hosting us here. I'm in this incredible room where they store donated clothing to help families who are displaced by family violence, and I thought it was a very suitable room to host my presentation for you. Just want to quickly talk a little bit about myself so you know the perspective where I'm coming from and my own lived experiences. I had a long road to policing. I'm the son of a refugee from Vietnam who came to North America during the war. We grew up in cooperative housing in the East End of Toronto. We grew up like many other immigrant families, working poor. But we had a good life, great parents, good family network. And my brother and I think were really drawn to a sense of security. He fell into teaching and I fell into policing, interestingly. I started my career working for an Indigenous tribal police service in British Columbia, Statlium Tribal Police, where I was exposed to a real sense of community policing at its roots. How I ended up working there is a whole other story for another day. I soon left and went to work for Victoria Police and later on for the Toronto Police Service, where I spent the last 18 years of my career. I recently retired in January of 2020. I want to talk about some lived experiences because along with my upbringing, I was exposed to a very serious and critical incident early on in my career. I was off duty and I was attacked and stabbed by a federal parolee 9 times and came very close to losing my life. I don't think that the aggregate of my life experiences has made me a better investigator or a better person. I had my struggles, as many people who are survivors of extreme violence and of abuse. But it gave me a perspective, my own perspective. And what I think it taught me, having looked back on my career, is a lot of empathy and understanding for victims of crime. And I found myself always in a very victim-facing role, which I found also very rewarding during my career. The end of my career in November and December of 2019, I was deployed by the Canadian government onto the policing mission in Ukraine, where I instructed both the RCMP and the National Police of Ukraine on the subject of family violence and domestic homicide investigations. It seems very relevant now with what's happened in the world. And this is where I started an idea of trying to build a network, a group of people to talk about this subject, to talk about trauma, to talk about family violence, and to talk about what our larger community is suffering from. And it seems like there's a cycle of violence that never ends in the world of family violence. Part of what I instructed on is what we in the policing world refer to as a case study, and I'm going to present a case study to you today. This information and these events have been fully litigated in the court. This is all public information. It is sensitive. I've tried to sanitize some of the images and the content, but the truth is intimate partner violence is blunt and is horrific. And to tell the story of Alan's death and his murder properly, it has to be told in a blunt manner. The presentation is 2 Million Reasons to Kill Alan Montang. Alan was 49 years old at the time of his death. He was a bookkeeper at the University of Toronto. He worked part-time also as a waiter for a catering service in Toronto. Very hard-working man. He was married to 31-year-old lawyer Dimitri Papasateriou. That's Alan's husband. Dimitri was born in Greece and was a dual Greek and Canadian citizen. He was a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School, and he worked in real estate law. In 2010, he picked up and he moved to Lucerne, Switzerland to pursue, allegedly, a master's in law. On March 2nd, 2011, Alan is observed leaving work. He's witnessed by his coworkers walking north to Bloor Street, and we learned that Alan lived exactly 35-minute walk away from home on Ossington Avenue. On his walk, he sends and receives text messages about an item he's bidding on eBay. And at 5:36 p.m., ADT Security, the security system at his home, receives an alarm call at 9:34 Ossington. At 5:39, an incoming phone call is recorded on Alan's cell phone. It goes unanswered, and we later learn that that is ADT. And it touches a cell phone tower close to his home, which tells us later, as investigators, that he was in the general proximity of his home. Toronto police are called for the first time, and at 6:03 p.m., ADT calls them. Uniform officers show up and advise that there's no signs of forced entry. They're trying to contact the key holder, and they can't get through to him because the key holder is Alan. And Alan is lying deceased on the other side of the front door. His phone is on vibrate. It's going unanswered in his pocket. The house is of a design that the officers are looking through windows, but they can't actually see anything. So they call a supervisor. He comes, and all the police eventually clear the scene. So that night, several texts and calls from friends go unanswered. They start off as a joke. And by 2:35 a.m., none of his friends are considering this a joke anymore. They're outside of 934 Ossington, phoning him and banging on the window, banging on the door and looking through the windows. And they also can't see that anything is amiss. Toronto police are then called a second time the following day or later on that morning. It's 4:46 p.m. One of the concerned friends has called 911 to report that Alan also didn't show up for work that day, which was very unusual. They report that he has no health concerns, and they're worried that maybe he's falling down the stairs because he lives alone. No one is suspecting foul play at this point. So the homicide squad eventually becomes involved. The attending officer listens to the complainant. He now, a day later, he feels a sense of urgency, and he kicks in the back door and the window under exigent circumstances to check on Alan's welfare. And Alan is found deceased in a pool of blood on the foyer floor by the front door. It appears that he was attacked as he'd walked in the front door. A little bit about the crime scene. Alan's right hand was ungloved. It was cold. It was March. And he still had the set of house keys in his hand. The ADT alarm panel inside the front door was broken off. It was lying on the floor. There's a drop of blood found on the outside doorknob, which told us at the beginning that perhaps someone who was involved in the violent interaction had then closed the door behind them, leaving blood from the inside on the outside door. And there was no signs of forced entry. Aside from the officer's damage to the back door and the window, no signs of forced entry at the front of the house. The locking mechanism is self-lock. Someone would have had to have a key. Of course, there was an autopsy several days later. The cause of death was ruled as blunt impact head trauma, and the injuries were described as being caused by an elongated rigid instrument. Numerous blows to Alan's head were catastrophic, and we were advised that death was most likely very quick. Several persons of interest came to light during the case of the investigation. One of them was Alan's husband, Dimitri. Dimitri was living somewhere in Europe at the time. Friends and his family seemed very guarded and cold when describing Dimitri to us. And on March 5th, so several days after the homicide, we had been unable to contact him. He phones the homicide squad, and he gets an investigator on the line. And to say he was standoffish is an understatement. I'll just play you that clip.
And when was the last time you actually spoke to him or communicated with him? On Wednesday. As far as I can, this week, Wednesday. On Wednesday? Yeah. And can you tell me what that was? I'm not going to tell you anything more. Can you answer my question?
This was unusual. This is our first contact with a loved one, a spouse, an intimate partner of our victim. And the call did not go as we anticipated at all. Eventually, Dimitri, who was a practicing lawyer at the time, he lawyers up.
Has he mentioned to you that he's got a problem with anybody? I'm not answering any questions, officer. Okay.
So it's now March 5th. We've been investigating this case for several days now, interviewing as many people as we could. And the husband of our deceased is refusing to provide us even basic information. When was the last time you talked to him? How often was your correspondence? How did you correspond? Was it email? Was it text message? He refused to provide a statement over the phone to us in the end, claiming that he understood his rights, which are his rights, and that he would have considered himself a suspect, or that he knows that we would consider him a suspect. Eventually, Dimitri did provide a formal statement. This is quite a while after the offense. He did not come home for the funeral. And so we began to look into Dimitri and Alan's relationship and their financial affairs. And it became very clear to us very early days that their relationship was quite strained. Dimitri was described by friends as moving to Europe on a whim, and the couple certainly couldn't afford his tuition expenses and the travel and living expenses, and they were very close to financial ruin. They had a number of high-interest credit cards well over the reasonable limit, well over the limit, and they could barely make their mortgage payments each month. And we had a ledger recording the cash that Alan was sending on a regular basis from his catering jobs to Dimitri in Europe. And these numbers just simply were not making sense to us at the time. Life insurance, we eventually found documents that indicated that in 2018, the couple had taken out a very expensive life insurance policy. It was non-revocable. Dimitri was named as the sole beneficiary, and Alan was insured for $2 million. And, this is a 45-year-old male of, medium health who made around $50,000 a year. To say that he was overinsured, in my humble opinion, is an overstatement. As in most cases, we're looking for forensic evidence as well as eyewitness evidence. There's DNA that comes up in this case. As most autopsies, the pathologist took nail clippings. This was a up close and personal altercation inside a very confined space of a front lobby, as investigators were hoping that there's a transference of DNA. And by May 6, 2011, so several months after the offense, the Center of Forensic Science, the CFS as we call it here in Ontario, issued us a report indicating that a male DNA profile, not Alan's, had been found underneath the right hand nail clippings of the deceased. However, there was no known offender on the Canadian databank managed by the RCMP. So we have known offenders, and that is an offender who's been convicted of a scheduled offense in Canada. There's a court order to have their DNA taken and uploaded to the DNA databank, and there's crime scene DNA. So that's DNA collected at various crime scenes. And each day the two databases speak to each other. And what we learned here is that there is no known crime scene DNA and no known offender DNA. Documents, many cases now involve computers and documents, and we found hundreds of thousands in the house. 2 computers, digital cameras, memory drives containing hundreds of thousands of websites visited, documents, financial records, travel information. We started writing production orders and warrants at that point. In Canada, most access to information is through a subpoena system called production orders. This is actually my second homicide since joining the homicide squad in December. It was actually the first one I was on call for, which is exactly what it sounds like on TV. A team goes on call and you basically remain on call until the next homicide hits. I just come out of organized crime enforcement. I had been on a wiretap team, so of course, the first few murders I worked, I was the search warrant writer. And during the investigation, a cell phone number of interest came to light. And we saw that during a visit to Toronto, Dimitri called the cell phone number 180 times. So in policing, we call that a clue. We learned that this cell phone number was actually associated to a voice over internet protocol phone number. So this is long before FaceTime and Zoom. There were VoIP programs that you could purchase, and you could make phone calls from your computer overseas for pennies on the dollar. Each of our computers at our house and at our businesses are identified by an IP address. That's that 99-digit you can see on the screen. And so we had to write another production order for the telcos to tell us who owned that particular IP address. And what we learned is that phone number was used to activate the Voice over Internet Protocol platform only 7 days before the murder from a Greater Toronto Area IP address. We tracked this IP address through the search warrant process. It was found to be a Rogers, and the scriber was an M. Ivisich. I just vetted out some personal identifiers here. So, you know, every homicide detective or every detective and in other fields, there's a moment in a case or a file that you always remember. I'm a bit of a geeky guy. I'm into major case management. This was my moment for me. It's not kicking down a door. I recognize the name, but, you know, I don't have a computer brain. We reviewed thousands of documents. And by this time, it was months later, our team had taken a number of murders since we had taken this case in March. So I look up from my email. I shout across the room to one of my partners on the team, Detective Leslie Dunkley. And I say, yo, Dunk, you know, he's a big basketball player, played university ball. So I called him Dunk. Yo, Dunk. You know, I shout out the name, and he lifts his finger up, goes down to a box he's digging around, very suspenseful. And he comes up, and Les had found this document. It was a boarding pass amongst thousands of other documents in the bedroom of the house months before. And he remembered the name. He had actually already done some background work on Michael Ivisich. Mladen Michael Ivisich was born in Croatia. He's a dual citizen with Canada. He'd been arrested back in 2004 by Peel Regional Police for property obtained by crime. It was fraud-related, no conviction. He had been investigated by the Toronto Police Service in 2003 for renting a truck with a declined credit card. And so to me, as an investigator, I'm thinking these are all fraud-related type offenses. And we have an overinflated insurance policy in the background. We have an uncooperative husband who's in Europe, has not come for the funeral and won't really provide us with any cooperation. Again, to me, this was a clue. So we put surveillance on Mr. Ivisich, and this was about 62 days after the initial homicide. We surveyed him with the hopes of collecting a DNA discard. So again, in the movie, DNA discard is a surreptitious collection of a coffee cup or a cigarettes. However, by May 13th, our surveillance team was not observing Michael at all anymore. And his cars were around, his family was around, but we hadn't had the opportunity yet to collect any DNA. So we continued to look into his background. One of the things that we did is we served a production order on the alarm company. We learned some very interesting information. So the alarm had just been installed in January of 2010, only about a year before. Only 2 key holders were listed, Alan and Dimitri, and only 2 key fobs were issued. And there was one in Alan's hand, the other one was apparently missing. We'd never done this before. We pulled the actual alarm pad off the wall and hoping that ADT can analyze it. So I wrote some more warrants, we served them on ADT, and they were able to analyze it, and they found us some very interesting information. They uncovered that at 5:19, someone had keyed in the code to disarm the alarm. And we know that Alan, having been witness leaving work, would have arrived home at around 5:37 p.m. So our theory is that, you know, someone is laying in wait inside the home for Alan. The alarm's then set off by the front door, someone leaving in a hurry, perhaps not deactivating the alarm, and the alarm goes off at 5:39, and Alan's blood is left. We now know from DNA that it's Alan's blood that's left on the outside of the door. So we've come up with a bit of what we call a narrative, a timeline. Someone comes into the home at 5:19 using a deactivation key or a fob. Alan arrives home at 5:37. There's a 2-minute violent interaction. The alarm goes off at 5:39. Blood from Alan and the interaction, perhaps with him, is left on the outside of the door. We begin to look into both Mr. Ivisich and Dimitri's travels, and we find that Michael Ivisich flew to Greece on May 10th. So remember, he threw surveillance on May 13th. So something happened around May 10th, and he leaves the country. Canada, we do not clear outbound passengers. So we do not track as a country who leaves our land by air. But the U.S. does, and we learned that he flew to Boston, Massachusetts. Immigration's Customs Enforcement in U.S. recorded his entry into the USA with his destination of travel to Athens, Greece. And Michael was found also to have flown to Switzerland the year before, and he had left his family and not returned actually until February 11th. So we're starting to put another travel timeline together. We know that Dimitri moved to Lucerne, Switzerland to pursue a master's in law back in 2010, and he left abruptly. Then we see that Michael has flown to Switzerland also in 2010. When we spoke and interviewed to Dimitri, he was in Athens, Greece with his family, He had dropped out of the law school program, and now we have Michael flying to Athens, Greece on May 10th. University of Toronto, so where Alan worked. We found some interesting information there. So we learned that Michael Ivizic had attended University of Toronto. He claimed to be a person by the name of Michael Jones, and we learned that this is an alias that he had used before. He handed in to the University of Toronto an insurance form, and this was the original insurance form. It had been signed and sworn by Dimitri in Greece, notarized by Notary Republic in Greece, and Mr. Ivizic claimed to work at a law firm. And we knew by this time that Dimitri actually fired his civil lawyer by this point. And interestingly, on the form, and we thought we were holding this information back at the time, someone had scratched out the cause of death, which, maybe someone would have normally written a natural or heart attack or cancer, and wrote in the word bludgeoned. And we had not released the cause of death to the media at this time. We found some interesting information through Canada Post. We had seized the marriage certificate belonging to Dimitri and Alan. And we had also seized Alan's birth certificate. And Dimitri required both of those documentary forms to file the $2 million life insurance claim. So there's a lot of back and forth about this. We come to learn that on April 19th, so a month and a bit after the homicide, someone signed on to the Service New Brunswick. Alan was born in New Brunswick, their Service New Brunswick website, making a self-request for a lost birth certificate for Alan. That birth certificate from New Brunswick was mailed to Ontario. It was sent to 934 Ossington. No one was home to accept it because Alan was deceased at this point. Dimitri was living in Greece. It was shipped to Canada Post, and Michael Ivizic attended the Canada Post, signed for it, and swiped his driver's license. We also found some information from serving warrants in the bank. We learned that on March 29th, Dimitri had written the TD Bank asking to cash out Alan's RRSPs. And we discovered that he had, in fact, successfully communicated with the bank to cash this out, and that a person attended the branch named Michael Ivizic, provided ID, and picked up that check. That check was handed over to him in the first week of May. He flew to Greece on May 10th. It was now about July 11th that we'd found this out. We found some information from Wendy's. I have another recording to play for you. On April 27th, an employee of Wendy's in Dublin, Ohio, received a voicemail from a male in Toronto inquiring about death benefits. Alan had worked for Wendy's corporate head office for a number of years. The caller claimed to be working with lawyers, and the suspicious Wendy's employee Googled Alan, saw that he had been murdered, and called us.
Hello, Kim. My name is Mike Ivizic. I'm calling in regards to one of your former employees that has passed on, and I'd like to get some information. I'm working with a lawyer that's handling this state. So if you can kindly give me a call back you can call me at 702-948.
So a few things about that call, 702, that's Arizona area code. It turns out to be a voice over internet protocol number, just like the 647 number. Michael Ivizic was not working with a law firm on behalf of Dimitri. In fact, as I mentioned, Dimitri had fired his lawyers at this time. Yeah, there was a civil suit going on. Of course, in every case, we want excellent forensic, CSI, forensic identification services evidence. Our FIS detectives identified a footwear impression believed to be from the killer inside the home. And this was an impression that was stitched together from a bunch of partial impressions. And this was checked through the RCMP and FBI footwear database. I don't know if anyone knows this, but both agencies maintain a footwear database of soles on shoes produced and sold in North America. And the results were negative. And I've used this database many times before. Generally, the sole will go in and at least can tell you what manufacturer it was, what size it is, etc. In this particular case, there was negative results, which seemed unusual. So one of our industrious FIS detectives named Matt Dak, he sent the impression to Europe. He had met another FIS investigator on a conference to the Forensic Institute of Zurich, and the report came back that the sole was recognized. It was produced in the Middle East for a mid-range hiking shoe only sold in Switzerland. And Michael and Dimitri had been tracked to Lucerne, Switzerland together. They'd lived there for a period of time. We eventually learned that they had been involved in a domestic type argument, and the Swiss police had been called to investigate both of them. And we also located a credit card charge at a sporting goods store called Von Moose from December of 2010, just a few months before the homicide. Computers, man, there's so many computers in this case. And they gave us some great evidence, but they also led us into some investigative problems. So we identified a Bell Simpatico email address for Dimitri, but the title of the email was toronto-lawyer@simpatico.ca, and rightfully, Bell was concerned about solicitor-client privilege within the emails. Just meant everything got slowed down. We had to convene an in-camera hearing at Superior Court. We had to articulate why we wanted visibility on what could be emails or emails with some privileged content around them. Superior Court judge assigned amicus, friend of the court, and a respected lawyer by the name of Paul Mergler had to read through 3,000 emails and slowly parcel out to the investigators stuff that was not solicitor related. And the emails were where we really started to develop a theory on the motive. In February of 2011, just days before the murder, Dimitri writes to Alan, "We need to speak." And this was so unusual. Like, I don't think they really spoke on the phone very often. Alan's so concerned, he writes back, "What's wrong?" Dimitri replies, "Nothing." He simply wants Alan to be home at a certain date at a certain time. Alan says he's working, but he can be home on the 2nd of March. On March 2nd in the morning, Dimitri emails Alan again and says, "Call me from home. Don't dilly-dally on your way home. Find shoes, shirts, and crystal balls." And the VoIP records that we had pulled also show corresponding calls between Dimitri's cell phone and this VoIP internet phone of interest that we believe Michael was using in the Greater Toronto area at the time. He was, keep in mind, he was in Toronto at the time of these calls. I dubbed this email the kill email. This is the plan being set into actual physical motion. The emails also detail the very intimate relationship between Michael and Dimitri, dating all the way back to 2008. Michael was living as a heterosexual man with a family in Mississauga. He had a wife, 3 children around university and adult age, and they'd apparently met on a website. Alan had found credit card payments made by Dimitri for flights with Michael's name attached to it. And we found several emails where Alan's challenging Dimitri on this. So the affair, by a certain point, had come to light, and Alan was clearly upset about it. There was also emails in relation to the University of Toronto life insurance claim, and as well the Toronto Dominion Bank RRSP withdrawal. So none of the investigators on the team felt that we had the final piece that made this more than just a circumstantial case. And we had no DNA. We had the possibility of DNA. There was what we believed the offender's DNA left on under Alan's fingernails. We did not have that. And we had no access to Michael in Greece to collect that DNA. And also, to make matters more complicated, Dimitri was also a Greek citizen, and Canada at the time had no extradition powers surrounding a Greek citizen. We had to write some mutual legal assistance treaties. Those are like international subpoenas for information, U.S. records, Gmail, Hotmail, just trying to demonstrate some of the work that has to go in to build these circumstantial cases into more than circumstantial cases. And of course, all the Greek records arrived. They're all in, the Hellenic language, so we had to get them translated. And it created months and months of additional work for us. So eventually we make the decision to place surveillance on one of Michael's adult sons for a DNA collection. So the Center of Forensic Science confirmed that they could compare the DNA from the crime scene, from a surreptitious piece of DNA from the son, and make a family or parental match. First, we had to establish that who the biological parents are. So we had to, write more warrants to Service Ontario to prove that. Our first 2 collections that we made during surveillance were contaminated. Both of the glassware from a restaurant had 7 different profiles on the rim. Eventually, though, by the summer of 2012, we were able to get a clean sample. It's from a set of chopsticks that we collected at a restaurant. And then on August 17th, 2012, CFS issues a report, and it concludes that the DNA underneath Alan's fingernails at the crime scene after Alan was deceased was likely the biological parent of Ivizic Jr. And so we felt certainly that we had grounds to arrest Michael at that time. The problem was, how do we get Dimitri back? We cannot extradite him. Well, greed, as it often does, took care of that problem for us. Dimitri had been involved in a very prolonged, and by prolonged I just mean like since Alan had been killed, a civil claim against Alan's family, Great West Life Insurance, Manulife, and others, University of Toronto, etc. We learned that he had grudgingly agreed to fly to Toronto for an important deposition. And at this point, we felt that we had grounds for arrest. Circumstantially, we had tied Dimitri to Michael. There was motive, and we had forensically tied Michael's family DNA to the crime scene. And we felt at the very least, grounds for arrest, we could apply for a DNA warrant at another time. So we executed on November 2nd, 2012, a number of search warrants across the Greater Toronto area. Several key items were found. We found the letter to Toronto Dominion Bank about the RRSPs. This is the original. We found a printed map to 934 Ossington, Allen's home, with notes. We found a BlackBerry cell phone. DNA on the face of that cell phone matched, they don't like to use that term, but it matched the DNA found at the crime scene under Allen's fingernails. So, you know, the killer had used that BlackBerry. That BlackBerry was in Michael's bedroom in like a shoebox and possibly had been used by him in the past. We found the Great West Life Insurance claim form. That claim form had obviously been tendered at the Toronto Dominion Bank because we were able to match fingerprints found in that document to the Toronto Dominion Bank employee. And Michael's wife had also kept a cheater's journal. It documented an affair that she had uncovered with Michael and Dimitri, dated back about 2 years. She had access to his email. And we also located the duplicate marriage certificate that was ordered from Service Ontario for the insurance claim. It was with Dimitri upon his arrest, and it had Michael's fingerprints on it. So, you know, we believe that they were together in Greece. That document had been mailed to Dimitri, and now we have Michael's fingerprints on it. So the case was getting stronger. Extradition from Greece was anything but easy. A Canadian warrant in the first was issued, then an Interpol red notice was issued. We notified the Greek authorities, and we waited for months. And this was a time when the Greek government was going through some extreme austerity measures. General government was not functioning very well or efficiently. He was arrested finally by the Hellenic National Police in January of 2013, walking his dog apparently at a park in Athens. And the clock was ticking on an extradition order. There's some bureaucratic rules that kick into place, so we started writing on that, waited for months, and then finally in June of 2013, a Greek-speaking police officer, Tom Zikas, and myself, we traveled to Greece to return Michael on June 7, 2012. We arrested him in the Athens airport holding cell, and we booked him back at 14 Division on June 8th in Toronto at the Toronto Police Service. Court proceedings, most investigations are done with the purpose of a strong court case, and what followed, in my opinion, can only be described as a total abuse of the court system. Very painful for the family. Hard on the investigators, although it's our job. After 3 separate bail attempts, 2013 and 14, Dimitri was released on bail. Both accused appeared before Justice Nakasuru and the Ontario lower court on March 31st, 2014. So we're now several years after the offense. The preliminary hearing, which is supposed to just last a few weeks, ran until September 11th, 2014. At the end of that, after all the evidence that I've just explained to you, Justice Nakasuru committed Michael to trial, but he discharged Dimitri. He did not feel that there was enough evidence to commit Dimitri to stand trial before a jury, which I was blown away. The Crown began a summary appeal, which is their jurisdiction to do, and in a really strange legal twist, and there was a number of these in this case, the Attorney General issued a preferred or a directed indictment, which is the AG of every province's ability to order police to arrest someone and direct them direct to trial. So the AG stepped in, circumvented the lower court system, even though he had been discharged. There wasn't a finding of not guilty, and he directed Dimitri to stand trial in the murder. That order was issued by Patrick Monahan. I don't particularly find court very exciting, but this played out like a legal drama on TV. The deputy AG was called as a witness and was cross-examined by James Lockyer, a very prominent and famous Canadian human rights lawyer. Again, I don't find court very exciting, but this was pretty exciting stuff. A number of trials and motions. Both of the accused fired their lawyers and became what we call in the system self-reps, which can be very arduous on the entire system. Judge Ian Nordheimer is the case management judge by this point. Again, he appointed amicus, or friend of the court, to help shepherd the accused to a trial. And the court had to endure self-rep motions after motions after motions. And I'm talking hundreds of these. These ran through 14, 15, all the way into 17, 4 years of motions. I was accused of planting evidence. The Center of Forensic Science scientists were accused of concocting evidence. The DNA data bank was accused of malfeasance. The crowns were asked to be removed. The judge was asked to be removed. In any event, we eventually make it to trial proper on September 17th, 2017. This is 7 years after Alan's death. On Monday, so the trial runs through September, through the winter, all the way until May 22nd, 2018, when the jury began deliberations. And after a week of deliberations, that was stressful, the jury sequestered while they're deliberating. On June 3rd, 2012, they returned and found both accused guilty of first-degree murder. They were both sentenced to mandatory life imprisonment. If you weren't aware, in Canada, a finding of guilt for first or second degree murder is mandatory life in prison. That individual is a ward of the Canadian state for the rest of their life. First degree murder, the minimum eligibility for parole, you have to serve 25 years. Doesn't mean you're eligible. It just means before you can apply for parole, you serve 25 years in custody. That conviction was over 8 years after Alan had been killed. Dimitri, some little wrap up here before I conclude. Dimitri's appealed his conviction. Michael has also appealed his conviction. Dimitri was released on bail, convicted first-degree murder. He is out in our community wearing an ankle bracelet, living his life. Alan's family wrote very nicely to the mayor-in-chief asking for a lot of the civilians and investigators that were involved to be recognized. And in March 2019, family flew in from New Brunswick. There was a ceremony, an award ceremony. And in December, after a very long trial process, I put in my retirement papers. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm free to, stop share here, take any questions that anyone in the audience might have.
Wow, thanks, Tam. Okay. Yeah, we do have about 8 minutes.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions. If you have a question for Tam, I ask that you refrain from raising your hand. Just instead, please enter your question in the actual video platform chat on the right hand of the side of the screen there. I'll be able to see your questions, and then we can get Tam to answer them. So Tam, while I'm waiting to see if there's any questions for you, I have a question because I've seen this case study before, but you mentioned your retirement right after. Yes. Did it actually have anything to do with that case?
I think it was just fitting that the timing worked out. The conviction in 2019, the family coming in, the award ceremony. I'd obviously met the family. They're very involved, as are many families for homicide victims in the trial process. A lot of communication between investigators and the family. You know, that relationship is often strained. We represent like the worst day in most families' lives. We're like the Grim Reapers. And so, you know, a lot of interaction with the family. Alan's mom flew in for New Brunswick and lived in Toronto for the entire 9 months of the trial. It was quite incredible.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, many of the family members came in for the verdict in the end. And so I think it was a nice conclusion, all of this kind of transpiring in 2018 and 19 leading up to when I decided to retire. Absolutely.
Absolutely a good conclusion. Now, do you find, obviously you've investigated quite a few of these kind of cases with domestic violence, I'm assuming. And do you find the justices serve for most of them, or do people actually get away with this? And then if they do, what? I mean, that's why this conference is on. We need to figure out ways to come up with stopgaps.
There's a question also from Stephanie. Do you have any trauma from working this file? If so, how do you process or deal with that? And I think your comment, Helena, and this question kind of dovetail together a little bit.
Okay.
The criminal justice system is a very frustrating system to navigate. It's very unfriendly for victims and very unfriendly, especially for victims' families where the actual victim of the event is deceased. but a homicide leaves a wake of victims in the path of the event. And so I never actually felt that there was a satisfactory event. Like, we're looking at a scenario where a loved one is gone and no conviction is ever bringing that person back. We also have an offender that has victims that they've left in their wake, family members, children, etc. They're getting convicted for murder and spending the rest of their life as a ward of the Canadian state. These are serious implications. So I don't know if I've ever felt that, justice is served, the process gets served, but it leaves a lot of damage in the wake, leaves a lot of trauma. The question about, did this case leave me with trauma? I had spent many years by this stage dealing with my own exposure to trauma. And, I had my own mechanisms, kind of, what I learned in early days in counseling as like a young 20-year-old police officer was talking in time is the only thing that heals trauma properly, proper talking in time. And so I have a very strong relationship with people. I'm very open about talking to experiences that I've experienced. And I find that really takes the weight off of my shoulders, is talking in time.
We have another question here. Have you ever helped a person who identifies as a male seek police assistance for domestic abuse during your career? If so, did you find that males are more reluctant to speak with investigators or constables?
So I had I consider it an extreme privilege of working in 51 Division for the Toronto Police, both as an investigator, as a sergeant, as a major crime detective. I investigated many murders in this division. And for those outside of Toronto, 51 Division is where there's a very racialized, condensed community called Regent Park. And also the Gay Village, which it is called by Torontonians, Church Street, is in that community as well. And when you police in 51 Division, you are interacting with victims of family and domestic violence. And those members come from across the LGBTQ communities. And so I have had a lot of interactions with investigating domestics and homicides that involve the LGBTQ community, like this homicide, for example. I've never particularly found that a member of the community has had a hard time dealing with myself and my partner or my investigative team. But I know that there is a stigma, and I know that in policing, we can do a much better job at, involving that community with solving crimes that happen in that community.
So there's a second part to that. Do you also think that the Toronto Police Services is better equipped now in 2022 to assist survivors of domestic violence? For example, are officers being trained to be trauma informed?
I want to think so. I think all agencies have a lot of growth to do when it comes to dealing with people who have been involved with trauma, especially in the workplace. And so, speaking from a police manager's perspective, I think in the last few years, the conversation of police suicide has really taken foot. There is some real trauma being suffered by police officers themselves. And if we can recognize that, or if they can recognize that and deal with that internally, I think they're better equipped to deal with the community at large who are suffering from trauma. So I would like to say I hope things are better, but I know people have their own lived experience with police who come away from it feeling re-victimized and re-stigmatized. And so I think all agencies, including police, can do a better job. Conferences and learning experiences like this maybe is a step in that right direction. I don't know what the solution for that is. Very complex social problem.
Wow. Do you ever find that there is some sort of stigma against the police where people are uncooperative in a lot of cases just because maybe they feel that you would not be, empathetic or anything, or are most people very cooperative in these cases?
Well, I don't know if there's a stigma against the police. I know that many members of the community at large do not like the way they feel when interacting with the police. There are some serious customer service issues that can be addressed. And so, again, it's a very complex issue. I try to treat people, having experienced my own experiences as a victim of crime. I hate the term customer service and policing, but really it boils down to that. I wanted to treat people how I remember being treated when I was a victim of crime, how I would want my mom and dad, be new immigrants to this country, coming from like a social economic neighborhood that, is not very affluent, but treated well by the police. And I know that, as diversity grows in policing, certainly Toronto Police Service, very, very diverse organization, a lot more empathy and understanding for the community that it serves has grown with that. And I've watched that within my 15 years working with that organization, over 15 years.
That's
I did
amazing.
the 2-minute timer. Now it's probably 0 time. So thank you everyone for joining in. There's 3 more speaking sessions. Abuse Hurts is an incredible organization. I've learned so much about everyone and what they do here. And thank you all for taking your time to listen to this presentation today.
Thanks so much, Tam. The next session is going to start in 15 minutes, and I invite you to return to the lobby and for some updates. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Tam.